court itself doesn't have any enforcement powers. So it's the highest judicial body of the United Nations, but it doesn't have, its own police or military force that would perform that kind of enforcement. What it does have, pursuant to the UN Charter, is resort to the Security Councils. And so that's the option. Clearly, the big problem with that is the UN, or the US rather, veto on the Security Council.
South Africa used genocide because that was its jurisdictional hook. That's how it could get before the International Court of Justice. And indeed, there is a very credible case of genocide. But the court will not resolve that case on the merits for some time to come. Today's ruling was just a preliminary ruling, which has a very low threshold of proof. But we should not let the genocide debate deter us from focusing on the other serious war crimes and crimes against humanity that quite clearly are going on.
Israel must immediately halt its military offensive and any other action in the Rafah governorate which may inflict on the Palestinian group in Gaza conditions of life that could bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part.
The International Court of Justice took a big step today. Up until now, its response to South Africa's genocide case against Israel had been basically in broad, generic terms to tell Israel, be more careful when you're bombing so you don't hit civilians, let more food in so there's not starvation. And that clearly wasn't working. And South Africa came in with an emergency application and said there are 1.4 million Palestinians sheltering in Rafah. These people are all in danger of effectively genocide. And the court, I think, bought that case. Obviously, it's not a very high threshold. It has to find only that plausibly the rights of Palestinians under the Genocide Convention are in jeopardy. But it found that, and I think with good reason. And the only real answer here is to order the military operation to stop and to order the Rafah boarding crossing to open. I think it's important to remember when analyzing the court's order today that there are two ways in which Palestinian civilians are in jeopardy. One is if a bomb falls on them, but the other is from starvation and deprivation. And the court, I think, went on at a bit of length about the fate of the 800,000 people who have fled Rafah, more than half of the people sheltering there, because, Israel basically would say, oh, these people are now safe. But the court said, well, no, because where you've put them essentially on a beachfront with, sand and no shelter and no food, they continue to be in jeopardy of starvation and deprivation. And so, in essence, the court was saying, your answer is not sufficient.
The crimes include starvation of civilians as a method of warfare, willfully causing great suffering, serious injury to body or health, or cruel treatment.
The other big factor here is what happened earlier in this week, because the other court in The Hague, the International Criminal Court, essentially charged Netanyahu with war crimes because of his starvation strategy. And if he responds to the International Court of Justice order today by saying, I don't care, I'm going to keep the starvation strategy going, that makes it much more likely that the pretrial chamber of the International Criminal Court will affirm the charges against Netanyahu. And it also, frankly, will be evidence against him at the ultimate trial. South Africa used genocide because that was its jurisdictional hook. That's how it could get before the International Court of Justice. And indeed, there is a very credible case of genocide. But the court will not resolve that case on the merits for some time to come. Today's ruling was just a preliminary ruling, which has a very low threshold of proof. But we should not let the genocide debate deter us from focusing on the other serious war crimes and crimes against humanity that quite clearly are going on. The indiscriminate bombardment, the disproportionate attacks having horrendous harm to civilians, and the starvation strategy. That was the focus of the International Criminal Court earlier this week. And those are clearly going on, regardless of what one thinks about the genocide charge.
The evidentiary basis for this order is crystal clear to me. South Africa has done a tremendous job in terms of its advocacy at the court on this question of genocide and around these requests for provisional measures. The legal material that's been submitted, as well as the oral advocacy, has really been top-notch and has really collated for us, created a dossier in a sense, and laid bare what the international legal and humanitarian community thinks about what's happening in Gaza and in particular in Rafah, and that is nothing short of a humanitarian disaster. And that's actually the language that the court used today. It said what had been a humanitarian catastrophe in March when it issued its last order has now deteriorated massively and is now a humanitarian disaster.
Against? Abstentions?
The court itself doesn't have any enforcement powers, so it's the highest judicial body of the United Nations, but it doesn't have its own police or military force that would perform that kind of enforcement. What it does have, pursuant to the UN Charter, is resort to the Security Council. So when it makes provisional measures of this kind, it then transmits those measures to the Security Council, and the Security Council is then sort of seized of the matter. I would expect, coming on the back of this most recent order, that we will see some kind of resolution at the Security Council around technically, enforcing this judgment by using Chapter 7 powers to order Israel to end its offensive in Rafah. And so that's the option. Clearly, the big problem with that is the UN, or the US rather, veto on the Security Council.
South Africa on May 10, 2024. I shall now recall.
When the ICJ orders a state to take certain measures, that state is then bound to comply with that order. And if it fails to do so, it is committed a wrongful act. And then the question is, what's the remedy or the response for that wrongful act? There are several. So states can choose to take countermeasures against other states. Nonviolent countermeasures would include things like economic sanctions, for example, in order to induce enforcement. All of that depends, obviously, on the political will in the situation. I think what we've seen this week, since the ICC prosecutor's announcement on Monday, is that really it's unclear where Western political opinion sits. There's been quite a bit of criticism, not only from the US, but from other member states of the ICC, which has been quite notable.
We don't recognize the jurisdiction of ICC the way it's being exercised, and it's that simple.